With the new league year starting in just a couple of days, Philadelphia is going to need to find some bargain options to fill big holes left by some of their star defensive players. I'm going to give you my top 5 most intriguing, cheaper offseason additions Philadelphia can find in free agency next week. I'm Thomas Mott. This is the Thomas Mott Show. What's up, guys? Thomas Mott here. Welcome to the Thomas Mott Show as we look at some cheap free agent options. Now, I know what you're saying. Thomas, why can't they just re-sign some of the players that we want them to re-sign? C.J. Gardner-Johnson, Javon Hargrave. Well, as we talked about on a previous show, they can't afford them. And so in order to find their replacements, you either use the NFL draft, which I'm sure they will, but I want to give you some options and some names to look out for that maybe Howie could sneak in and grab, much like they did with Kaiser White, some other options in free agency last year, who are going to be cheap, maybe not super cheap, but cheap enough for Philadelphia and would make some sense. First place, we're going to go ahead and look. Obviously, we're using Sport Track here. Sport Track does a very good job of giving you what they made last season, and that's kind of the focus here is, are they going to get a raise? Are they going to stay about the same? But let's start with the running back spot, because that is where a lot of people are very curious about what Philadelphia is going to do. If they don't take Bijan Robinson, they don't take Jahmyr Gibbs, you have some free agent options. Again, assuming Miles Sanders is not coming back, I don't think that he will. You got to find somebody who's cheaper than Miles Sanders, aka cheaper than $8 to $10 million a year. And honestly, there's a couple of really good options here. A lot of Eagle fans would love Kareem Hunt. He made $6 million this past season. He's been tied to Philadelphia multiple times at the trade deadline. I like the idea. The question is, how much does Kareem Hunt want? Because Philadelphia is not going to pay more than $6 or $7 million a year for a running back, maybe even more than $5 or $6 million a year, and so Hunt could be on the expensive side. But as you'll see, there's at least a lot of running back options versus some of the other position groups we'll talk about here on the show today. Jamal Williams would be hands down my favorite pick. If I could take any of the free agent running backs, I think he runs hard. He's very physical, comes off a 1,000-yard season. He had a ton of touchdowns. The problem is he's going to want more than $3 million a year. And so you're going to say, Thomas, let's take Jamal Adams. He made $3 million this year. He's probably going to look for 10 in free agency. And so I don't think he's going to be a realistic cheap, and that's the point of the show, option for Philadelphia. Some other names here, obviously Boston Scott. I think they're probably going to bring him back. We'll see about that, though. There's one other name to me that makes an absolute ton of sense. The question, again, is going to be how much money will he actually go ahead and command, and that is David Montgomery. Now, David Montgomery only made $1 million last year, so he's going to want more than that. But is he going to want $10 million? Probably not. Is he going to want $6 million? $5 million? That would make some sense. And then you have kind of the 1-2 punch of the quick, speedy, pass-catching Kenny Gainwell, and then the physical downhill runner that is really David Montgomery. And so I think Montgomery makes an absolute ton of sense for Philadelphia, especially in that quote-unquote cheap price range that we're trying to find here, because again, the expectation is Philadelphia is not going to have a ton of money. Let me know which running back you guys want to get if there is one. Again, got to think cheap today. We're thinking cheap options for Philadelphia. I'll see what you guys think down below right now. All right, over to wide receivers. Trying to think about a wide receiver 3 option because they might not go ahead and hang on to Quez Watkins, or they might hang on to him. I don't know yet, but there are some options here. We got to think money, though. Robert Woods' name gets thrown around a bunch. He made $16.2 million last year. Now, didn't play good enough. Only had 527 receiving yards to get similar money in 2023, but still, Woods will probably demand $8 to $10 million, and as a wide receiver 3, that's way too much money for me, and so you got to find the discounts here when you're looking at free agent wide receivers for Philadelphia to possibly be in kind of that number 3 slot area. So Jarvis Landry obviously jumps out there. The age is why he's going to be so cheap. I think he makes a ton of sense. It could really eat as a number 3 option for Philadelphia. I think Olamide Zaccheaus, again, it's a name you might probably not have heard a lot. I live in Atlanta, so obviously I know a lot about him. He was supposed to be a lot better this season than he was, but the Atlanta passing game with Marcus Mariota and then Ritter was terrible. He's another cheap wide receiver 3 option if you wanted to kind of mix things up. But for me, if I had to pick somebody, Mecole Hardman. Already said Kansas City's not going to be able to go ahead and bring them back because Kansas City, much like some of the good teams in the National Football League, will be a little bit I'd say conscious going into free agency period, and so Hardman becomes available. He comes off of a surgery, and so an injury concern is obviously there, but he's cheap. He's not going to get $15 to $18 million a year like you saw some receivers get last season just due to the fact that the production's been a little bit down for Mecole. If you could get Mecole Hardman for $8 million a year, even $6 million a year as your number 3 super speedy slot guy who could also return kicks, I am 100% for that. Big thumbs up for Mecole Hardman. I think he makes an absolute ton of sense for Philadelphia. He would be my top free agent option right now if we're talking about cheap people behind David Montgomery, or, of course, as we mentioned, Kareem Hunt, if he wants to be cheap enough. All right, I want to mention quickly here before we get into some defensive options, my March Madness fantasy betting league that I have right now. I'm trying to just get together a bunch of you guys who follow the show all into one big fantasy betting pool where we actually have money that you can win, where you don't have to put any money down in order to actually play. Now, you got to go ahead and pick one of these DraftKings or FanDuel or BetMGM betting websites that you haven't signed up for already. That gets you into the league. And all you got to do is, place a $5 to bet it for DraftKings and then send us a picture of the bet slip. And then you're entered in to what could be a pretty big prize pool. Top 10 players going to, make it fair in terms of the percentage of the payout, but will win money. And each person that joins, we add another $50 into the pot, myself and the TFM guys. Really fun league here. I'm going to be in it. We're going to be talking about it during March Madness. Get into the sports betting game with any of our partners here. Send over your bet slip to Jeremy at SavageVentures.com and jump into the Fantasy Viget League. It's going to be a bunch of fun. All right, now here's where it gets a little bit more difficult, and that is some other positions of need for Philadelphia. We're going to look at linebacker, safety, and defensive lineman. Linebacker's really tough because the problem is there are some interesting names. Look at Eric Kendrick, look at Levante David, you look at, aging Deion Jones. They all made a bunch of money last year. Will they take discounted deals? Maybe someone like an Eric Kendricks who's 31 years old, maybe someone like a Devin Bush who's not really done much throughout his career, obviously with Pittsburgh, maybe. But there isn't really a name that I look at on this list and go, oh, I absolutely have to have him. I would much rather re-sign TJ Edwards, if I'm being honest. Much rather re-sign TJ Edwards and then roll with, Nakobe Dean as your outside linebacker. That makes the most sense for me because, sure, Kyle Van Noy, his name has been thrown out there a little bit. Robert Spillane, Corey Littleton in Carolina. It just isn't somebody that I say, oh, I absolutely have to have. For me, it'd be re-sign TJ Edwards because he's not going to be that expensive, maybe $5 or $6 million a year on a 3-year deal, and then go ahead and start the rookie in Nakobe Dean. Let's go here and go to cornerback and just show you what we're looking at here in terms of free agent options at cornerback. A couple of these names at the top you can't afford. You can't afford Shaquille. You can't afford Marcus Peters. Bradley Roby's going to be a little bit too expensive, but there are some quote-unquote cheaper names if you wanted to. Isaiah Oliver, the former Falcon, he only made $2.385 million last year. Byron Murphy from Arizona. I think Philadelphia, though, is going to draft somebody. I think whether it's number 10, number 30 in the second round, I think they're going to roll with Darius Slay on one side and a young guy, Zach McPherson, or a draft pick on the other side. And just to show you, there really isn't a name that I think would be perfect for Philadelphia here at the cornerback spot. Now, when you go to safety, again, because they're most likely losing C.J. Gardner-Johnson, as we have talked about, there are big names like Jesse Bates, who you would love to have, but he's way too expensive. Jordan Poyer from the Buffalo Bills, again, way too expensive. But there are some interesting options here if you wanted to get, let's just say, tricky. Jonathan Abram with Seattle, formerly drafted of the Raiders, is a guy who's grossly underperformed, but maybe in the right system could make a little bit of headway. You look at a name like Terrell Edmonds, who's probably going to get paid a lot more, but if you wanted to splurge on a safety that's still very good but cheaper than C.J. Gardner-Johnson, he would make some sense as well. But there really isn't a name here that I think is perfect for Philadelphia, which is why they're very happy about Reed Blankenship and probably going to re-sign Marcus Epps. And so while I have some position groups like running back and wide receiver where I have a person I want Philadelphia to take, there are other position groups where it just doesn't make a lot of sense for the Eagles at all. Let's go ahead and wrap up here with the defensive line, just kind of show you what we're working with here. Again, Philadelphia not going to spend a lot of big money. They can't afford Javon Hargrave. They're going to lose him. They're not going to pay Fletcher Cox anything close to what he is going to command in the free agent market. I think they're going to bring back Brandon Graham. The report from Howard Eskin talked about that on the show, I believe, yesterday. Says they're going to bring back BG. But to show you what else we have here, there aren't a ton of options to kind of replace the Javon Hargrave situation. A'Shawn Robinson is a name that does pop out a little bit. He did have 42 tackles last season, kind of more of a hybrid defensive tackle who can kind of plug the hole. He would make a little bit of sense there. Akeem Hicks is similar in that area. Cleveland Farrell, if you wanted to go real cheap, because he'll make less than $7 million this year, but also get somebody who is still maybe a project. I don't really like that at all, but it's another name that pops out that would make some sense as well. But as you see on this list, there isn't somebody that would make sense from a money standpoint. Yannick Ngakoue would be great. I think he still has a lot left in the tank, 10 sacks this past season, but they're going to re-sign Brandon Graham. They have Josh Sweat. They obviously have Hassan Reddick, and Ngakoue commanded $13 million last season. So money is the issue, and that's why I wanted to do this show, just to showcase what Philadelphia could get, but what they really potentially could afford. Now, the cap space has always been the quote-unquote a myth. That's the joke. Any team can kind of work around a cap space, and so Howie Roseman has notoriously been great working around cap space. And as we've talked about, if they, restructure Lane Johnson, restructure Darius Slay, if they get Jalen Hurts on the massive extension, then and can free up some money this season for a 1 or a 2 year deal on one of these quote-unquote better players, and then you kind of have a all-in move like Philadelphia did this past season. But if they don't do those things and they have very little money in free agency, look for some of these cheaper options that we talked about on the show today, like Mecole Hardman, like David Montgomery, maybe like one of the, cheap cornerbacks that could actually make some sense for Philadelphia, and that's why I wanted to get you some names going into the weekend as we get ready for what's going to be a crazy week next week. So, as we end, be sure to subscribe. I would love to get to 10K by the start of free agency, but I'm going to be going all over the place for NFL news, Philadelphia Eagle news, everything regarding the National Football League for free agency. This is your one-stop shop, so be sure to go ahead and subscribe and stay tuned for that. I'm Thomas Mott. This has been the Thomas Mott Show.